Story 1. Had this substitute all the time in high school. He would bring this licorice candy that resembled chalk and placed it on the blackboard ledge without anyone noticing. Starts introducing himself and says he's weird because he likes eating chalk, proceeds to pick up the candy chalk and eat it. When everyone looks at him like WTF, he revealed it was candy. Super weird guy, but I guess that's an interesting way to be remembered. Story 2. Had a couple of weird teachers. One punched a hole in the wall because people weren't paying attention. He also punched out a window because too many people failed a test. Was a really nice guy, and we were in a temporary building, but that was just weird. Had another teacher that was striving to get our attention. One day, he promised to teach a full hour upside down if we were quiet for that one lesson. We were actually quiet since we all wanted to know if he would actually do it. And the next class, he walked up to the blackboard, put his hands on the floor, kicked his legs up against the blackboard, and was teaching like that. He was pretty red at the end. Had another teacher that was a bit on the wild side. If a pretty woman walked past the building outside, he would jump on the windowsill and start pounding the window like a gorilla. He also had a sacrificial dish that would get thrown to you if you weren't quiet 5 minutes after class had started. But the best part was, since he was a chemistry teacher, we made him promise to show us how to make a stink bomb by the end of the year if we were in a good class. So we had a good class for the whole year. At the end of the year, we reminded him of his promise. He said he remembered. He got some chemicals from the locker, switched on his Bunsen burner, and proceeded to mix the chemicals, explaining what he was doing and why, the chemistry involved and stuff. He then put it on the burner, casually walked out of the class, and locked the door, while we were all in horror watching this yellow smoke coming up from the teacher's desk. He was laughing maniacally at our attempts to lessen the smell. He even got our economy teacher out to laugh with him. Great prank. Story 3. When I was a teacher in college, I noticed I'd been assigned to a fourth-floor room with a really wide ledge below it that was hard to see. So on the first day of class, I arrived half an hour early when the room was empty. I climbed out the window onto the ledge, then waited with a book until I was 10 minutes late, and then climbed in the fourth-floor window to introduce myself. It made the impression I hoped for. Story 4. I guess it's as sad as it is weird, but I vividly recall one of my teachers, who was usually quite strict when it came to most things, and was actually a really good teacher, coming into class one day. She was late for the first time ever, sat at her desk, and began crying over a breakup. She didn't address anyone. She just sat there and cried. Like I said, she was always a bit strict, so we all just kind of sat there for the remainder of the class, and somehow managed to make small groups and began practicing for an upcoming quiz. It was a language class, in order to give her some space. Nobody ever mentioned it to anyone in admin, from what I can tell. And then she came in the next class, sincerely apologized, and also commemorated us for making our one study group, instead of, sitting there awkwardly. She was a great teacher, a really nice person, and with the exception of that one time, always professional. So although we found it to be weird, I guess we just gave her a pass and moved on from there. Anyone is capable of having such a low point. With all of that being said, I have taught before, albeit at university level, and I still think it was unprofessional and weird. But I don't know. I suspect that it may have been difficult to have quickly found a substitute. Story 5. Had a teacher who was rumored to be a huge pothead, went to Woodstock, etc. Anyways, at one point in class, he told us to get started on an assignment. Then walked to the back of the class where there was a closet with a water heater in it, for whatever reason. There was nothing in there but a water heater. He walks in, squeezes himself in next to it, and closes the door behind him. He stayed there for about 20 minutes. Either that closet was a TARDIS or that dude was high AF not knowing where the hell he was. Story 6. My 6th grade teacher was an alcoholic, and she drank out of a coffee mug. I thought she drank iced tea. She was a tough but fair teacher, and she made learning fun. The weirdest was that whenever she made a joke, she laughed at herself and swayed when she wrote on the blackboard, mumbling to herself. She also walked like she was slightly off balance. The class, at least the classmates I spoke with, thought she was quirky. Lastly, I noticed that every time she spoke to me, her breath smelled like mouthwash, but at the time, I was oblivious to the fact that she was drinking. And looking back, it seems that she hid it well. Many years later, I bumped into one of my classmates from that time, and in our conversation, 6th grade came up, and he blurted out, "You know Miss S was an alcoholic, right?" I replied, "No way." And he described situations during her class where she stumbled and slurred her words. I remember those instances, but it never dawned on me that she was drinking on the job. Story 7. Freshman year, linguistics. Professor was an overweight Russian guy with a heavy accent, probably in his mid to late 30s. Had a habit of sitting on the desk in front of the room while lecturing. One day, class begins, and I notice his fly is open, and it seems he's going commando because there's definitely a fleshy patch visible. I'm looking around the room and see many others who seem to have noticed, but no one wants to embarrass the guy since we barely know him, and it's only a couple weeks into the semester. As he walks back and forth lecturing, his nutsack is slowly making itself visible, like someone slowly blowing a bubble with bubble gum. Front row is mostly girls, and I can see they are a mixture of horrified and barely controlled laughter. Still, no one can bring themselves to say a word about it. Finally, he makes his move. He boosts himself onto the front desk, plops down, and the back pressure created by his mass makes his burst forth from his unzipped fly into the open air like a breaching whale. He doesn't notice, or at least acts as though he doesn't notice. He continues the rest of the lecture as if nothing is amiss. I cannot fathom how he had no reaction or awareness that his balls are on display at seated face level about 8 feet from the front row of students. Class ends, and everyone bolts out of the room with mixed looks of disgust, mirth, and shock. Would have loved to have seen the professor's reaction when he later finally realized he was hanging crumpet for some unknown amount of time. Story 8. He was having trouble with his dog, a boxer if I remember correctly, getting into stuff at home while he and his wife were away at work. The solution to this was to set up a video call with speakers and video in the rooms where the dog was and chastise the dog over video, on the projector in front of the whole class. The dog didn't listen at all, which made it even better. Story 9. I had been told that a professor I had ate chalk, so I asked him about it. Grabs a piece of chalk, pops it in his mouth, eats it, and says, "It's really not that different from Tums." Same guy once stopped lecturing, knocked on the whiteboard, walked to the edge, put his face against the wall as if to look behind it, stated, "I could hide my treasure back here," and then continued lecturing as if nothing happened. Story 10. I was taking a crappy film history class for a gen ed at the local community college before I transferred to a 4-year. And the teacher was this weird guy who was in his late 60s, had dreadlocks, and was really into health and fitness, and liked to talk about weird stuff all the time, like how he bet he could outrun the 20-year-old men in the class in a race. One day, in the middle of a lecture, completely out of the blue, he pointed to a girl in the middle of the class who looked 18 or 19 and asked, "Who has a reason for why I shouldn't be in a relationship with her?" The first person says because he's her teacher, so he says okay, but what if I weren't her teacher? Then somebody says he's significantly older than her, and he says he's really healthy and plans to live past 100. After an uncomfortable amount of time, somebody finally says there is no reason they shouldn't be together, and he says, "That's right." And we continued with the lesson like it had never happened. It wasn't relevant to anything. Story 11. I had a history teacher who had been through a lot of action in Vietnam. He was showing us the PBS series on the American Civil War, and during a scene with lots of battlefield noises, men screaming, cannons, and gunfire, he had a PTSD flashback. He started screaming for us to get down, so we all got down under our desks. After a few minutes, he came to and told us he was joking, that we all did well. He left the room and did not come back that class period. He was a great guy. Story 12. High school science teacher showed us an old video about the dangers of electricity. Featured a girl trying to hit a shuttlecock out of a tree, hitting an overhead wire with a racket, and falling to the ground screaming. He rewound and replayed the scene at least 20 times while laughing and grunting. Story 13. High school biology teacher showed us a video of a woman giving birth. After the video ended, she accidentally pressed rewind without stopping the video first. Good old VCR days. Making us watch the whole thing in reverse. Imagine a man grabbing a baby by its head and sticking it back in. Story 14. A friend of mine's sister was sitting in the chemistry classroom. Everyone started to get lethargic and dizzy, complaining of headaches. The teacher realized she had left the gas on and just chuckled like, "Whoops, almost killed all my students." She didn't say that, but that's just the energy she had, and turned off the gas. And our nutrition teacher made us eat boiled chicken feet for a grade, but that's probably standard in her class. Story 15. One of my classmates brought these two steel magnetic marbles to school and was playing with them in class. Our 8th grade English teacher confiscated them, slid them under her bra, fished them out, and gave it back to him. Of course, he didn't want them back after that. Story 16. One of my English professors had a giant misshapen head with wisps of black hair in odd places that he never combed. His glasses never fit straight, and he preferred teaching in his socks. Just weird. That said, he invited the whole class over to his home at the end of the semester for a potluck lunch. The few of us who actually showed up had a surprisingly fun time. He shared his vinyl collection of classical music with us and told us some great stories. Story 17. So this wasn't a teacher, but it was the dude who gave people detentions, and you'd serve them with him. I guess that every kid in school was on a good streak that day, so no one was in the room. It was just him, and I had to talk to him to reschedule a detention because I had a doctor's appointment the day it was scheduled. I had walked up to his door, and his desk and PC monitor were visible through the glass in the door. I saw him watching gay on Pornhub. I sat there confused for a minute because he would walk around the school bragging about his wife, and then there he was. I took it to the principal, but they didn't do anything because I had no proof. And now the detention teacher is the principal. Story 18. My teacher was this depressed 50 or 60-year-old man that weighed about 600 pounds and had a really bad eating problem. He was almost always eating, and he always tried to involve food in the lessons as much as possible. One day, the whole class had pizza. I think the school gave us pizza for winning something, and one kid threw a whole slice of pizza in the trash after they were done eating. Rather than wasting the pizza, my teacher picks the slice out of the trash and starts eating it. And I'm pretty sure he called the kid out for throwing away a perfectly good slice of pizza, too. I have a similar story. My gym teacher was the loud coach type. He was a huge man, 40 or 50 years old, and very, very overweight. Then one day, I guess something in his head clicked because he was absolutely set on losing as much weight as possible. From that point on, we always saw him outside running, doing sit-ups or push-ups. He would even stand by the garbage can in the cafeteria to pick the veggies off the kids' plates before they were thrown away. Vividly remember him screaming, "Give me your effing carrots," on more than one occasion. It worked though, because the next summer he was quite unrecognizable. Some students didn't even know who he was. Story 19. The entire class was once convinced the math teacher ate a robin whole. One had flown through the window, and he quickly ordered the whole class to leave the room and said something like, "I will deal with this." Seconds later, he let us all back in and kind of licked his lips, as if he had just finished up a tasty treat. Of course, the robin likely just flew away, but I prefer this version of events. Story 20. In high school, we had a recurring sub that no one liked. He was somehow everyone's sub, so he was on campus for someone at least once a week. This guy was a short, stout, sweaty man with a comb-over compared to Homer Simpson. He'd come into class, pits and the back of his shirt already stained, and begin shouting at all of us high schoolers about general rules. Every period we had with him was the same. He'd yell at us sternly about staying in our seats, raising our hand to talk, yada yada. Then he'd brag about making a class of kindergartners cry. He'd say it in a way that suggested he'd do the same to us, which is baffling given the circumstances. Imagine a room full of deprecating teens who do not give a crap being told this. We took it as a joke, and never really were well behaved when he was the sub. I remember one of the first classes I had with him. A group around me agreed that if the time came, they would absolutely ruin his day if they wanted to, just to prove his little threat meant crap. Story 21. I had an excellent calculus teacher in high school, and the school knew they were lucky to have him, so they kind of looked the other way when he did crazy stuff. The students loved him too, and he was always the kind of teacher that would go out of his way to help and make the class fun. But he did a lot of things that were pretty nuts. He often jumped up on his desk and would say things like, "Superman!" One time, he reenacted the killer bunny scene from Monty Python with a crumpled piece of tissue sitting on a table. He yelled, "Killer bunny!" while diving onto the table and proceeding to break it. One thing he sort of got in trouble for was one day he decided to take the American flag in his room and march all his students down the hall while loudly shouting patriotic things. Also, during a pep rally one day, he convinced another teacher to wrestle with him during the middle of it. I missed that class. Story 22. There was a joke in 10th grade that this one girl looked like Mickey Dolenz in a wig. Nothing mean-spirited, but she really could have been related with how much she looked like him. In one of my classes, we had to build websites from scratch based on our favorite band, mine being the Monkees. The teacher sees I have a picture of Mickey pulled up for this project. He comes over and tells me to move. Confused, I do. He opens that picture in Photoshop, finds a random brunette whose hair looked like this girl's, and layered them so it was Mickey's face under the hair. He proceeded to print out a couple copies and hid them in her textbooks. She didn't find the first one until the next class period. The funny thing is that her first question was, "When did I wear my hair like this?" Story 23. When I was in high school, our vocational department had an auto body teacher who was a raging alcoholic. He'd show up in the morning with the smell of liquor on his breath, tell kids on the first day that he didn't care what they did or where they went as long as they didn't bother him or get in trouble, and then put his head down and slept off a hangover at his desk. Every single day. That guy only got the job because the previous guy was also a raging alcoholic and got into a car accident that killed 4 students. He was trying to bang one of them, a sophomore girl at the time, on the way back from a concert. That guy was so wasted he was making jokes about it at the hospital. Story 24. Not necessarily weird, but the one experience with a substitute that stands out to me the most. My freshman year of high school, I was taking a healthcare class. Our teacher was making us take an OSHA course. Hated all 26 hours I spent for that damn certificate. But for the majority of it, she was on vacation. It was graded and pretty heavily weighted, making it necessary for me to complete it and do it well in order to get a 4.0 GPA. When she was gone, we had the same substitute every day. She was pretty old from what I remember, and I'm confident she had a hearing problem, as she always seemed to talk on the louder side, even when really up close. One day, I'm having issues with my OSHA course, and I emailed my teacher, but she didn't respond for a while, so I took my problem to the substitute. I was hoping that somehow she could help me figure it out. After a while, her and I were each pretty dumbfounded, and I returned to my seat. I'm not sure if she liked my attitude, my attempt to problem solve, or just the fact that I found other work to do throughout my frustration with the OSHA course. Later on during this class period, she came up to me and began to vent to me about things that weren't currently going on in her life. Now, they weren't just classic things like everybody treats substitutes so poorly when they're really trying. Part of it was this, but she also had told me about how a couple months ago, her husband had passed away because of a heart attack while boating. He didn't come home that night, and it took about 48 hours for somebody to call in a boat that appeared to be passengerless. She told me about how a couple of her teeth had been really hurting, and she figured out she needs surgery for some sort of dental problem that she cannot afford. Her daughter had just given birth to a stillbirth. She eventually went back to her desk, grabbed her phone, and proceeded to show me cute and funny little Facebook posts that made her smile. I admire that woman's perseverance and her quirks. It hurts my heart when I remember that my friend told me she walked by the classroom that same day at lunch, and she saw the teacher crying by herself. Whenever I see her in the hallways, I always make sure to say hello and ask her how she's doing. I'm not sure if she remembers telling me all that, but I remember her stories. I hope she's doing great things.
Story 1. In GCSE English, she taught us the wrong novel for almost the entire term. We read this book over and over, answered essays, and remembered and studied every significant narrative meaning. Apparently, none of the faculty heads had checked up on him until about 6 weeks before our exams, when they realized all of our work was on a book not even on the syllabus, and all our time was effectively wasted. So to rectify it, we lost all our PE lessons, had to stay late after school 3 days a week, and spend 3 out of 5 lunch breaks cram learning the actual book with another teacher. Safe to say our class wasn't happy at all, and most parents complained as it would affect our ability to pass the exams. Story 2. Head teacher of my high school tried to expel me for having an epileptic seizure in front of him. said I was a danger and distraction to other pupils and was disrupting his school. I ended up being kept out of school for 2 months while my parents fought my case. In that time, almost all of the rest of the teaching staff, who were furious with this decision, kept me supplied with work and even one-to-one tutoring when needed. This was in a rural area where the next nearest school was 40 miles away, so we had no other school choice. My brother was finding his balance of medication while in high school and would have a seizure every so often in class. That by itself is embarrassing. Why the hell would somebody make it much more difficult for you? I'm sorry, friend. People suck. Story 3. 40-degree weather, Celsius, in outback Australia, and she wouldn't turn on the aircon in class even though it worked. Her reason was that when she was young she didn't have an aircon, and she survived. All the students hated her. Mine was the reverse. In the middle of winter up in the Blue Mountains, she wouldn't turn on the heater in the mornings because she grew up without heated classrooms. And it's like, yeah, but you guys were allowed to wear giant effing coats, were you not? Story 4. At university, my professor did not tell us the time of our examination, despite numerous emails from 20-odd students, as well as the head professor of the course. This exam could have been any time from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and I lived 90 minutes from campus and relied on crap public transportation to get to uni. It got to 9 p.m. the day before the exam. No one knew when the exam would be, and if we missed it, we would all fail the whole module. So I took the train to the city where my uni is, booked a cheap, crappy hotel for the night, just to make sure I was there on time. We all took the exam at 12 p.m. after getting an email an hour before the exam was being held, so I wouldn't have made it in time if I stayed home. Worst part was that no one cared, not the professor, not the course lead, or the head of our school. They all just left 30 students in the lurch, allowing them to potentially fail the exam and therefore the module. Sounds like a small university. The university I went to had a student population of around 10,000, so not huge. All our exam dates and times were published when we register for courses. This could be changed in the first 2 weeks through registrar's office, but proper notice would be required. Story 5. In my second semester of my first year of law school, everyone in my class, 80 plus people, had to take a research class. This class was taught by 4 different law librarians, but followed the same syllabus. It was also worth 1 credit. These librarians ran the class as if it was 3 credits. We had to read, conduct legal research, and write 2 memos throughout the semester, when we had 5 other classes all within 2 to 4 credit range, plus 1 specific class was notoriously difficult. Anyway, halfway through the semester, my class gets pissed at the workload to credit ratio, and someone starts a petition to reduce the number of assignments and or change the grading for the class from a letter grade to pass or fail. Almost the entire class signs. There were a few holdouts. The student who started the petition delivers it to the librarians. The librarians remove 1 or 2 assignments, but otherwise disregard the petition. Those who signed all awkwardly suffered through the rest of the semester. Story 6. Forced us to make a donation to a charity. When I didn't bring anything in, I got a demerit. Had to argue that not everyone has the ability to give something away. She then told me off for backchatting in front of the class. Everyone was like, WTF? Story 7. My work sent me on a 3-day advanced Adobe Illustrator course last April in London. Just before the exam, the tutor said, "Oh, by the way, there may be a few questions on this exam we haven't talked about. Just do your best." What the actual F? My work just paid 1,000 euros for this. His response was that he can't be expected to teach everything. There were about 6 students in the class, and we were all pretty annoyed. Story 8. She didn't believe in field trips because she said that kids would have too much fun, and learning isn't supposed to be fun. However, the entire grade would take the trip, so she was required to take us. So she would make us all sit in the common area of the zoo, museum, etc. And she would hold classroom lessons. It was so upsetting to hear about all the cool things the other kids got to see while we had class. The fact that I still remember things I learned on field trips compared to the countless times I was in classrooms says a lot. Sad to see some teachers think like yours. Story 9. He would act like he was enlightened and say stuff like, "Video games rot your brain. All your free time should be spent on education as that is all that matters." But then, during the lessons, he would go completely off topic and start talking about random stuff. Apparently, he is making a board game that could compete with chess because he is just that brilliant. Story 10. Screamed at the class because he assumed that an intermittent beeping sound that occurred throughout the lecture was somebody receiving text. It was the projector that he was using, alerting him to the fact that it was overheating. Dummy. That's almost as good as the time a substitute tried to confiscate a student's phone when it beeped. It was a diabetes thing attached to the student's body. Story 11. I had a college professor who was teaching a history course to a bunch of education majors in their junior year. She would ask us questions all the time about things she hadn't yet lectured on, and then pull the, "Really? No one knows the answer to this?" well, I guess we'll just wait for someone to answer. We were all education majors. We knew that trick. Waited her out. Every single time. She always broke first. People that are asking, what's the trick? This was a poorly executed attempt at using the Socratic method. It's better to have students arrive at an answer themselves than it is to tell them. However, you have to first create an environment of trust and respect so that the students are comfortable enough to risk a wrong answer, and you have to be willing to provide a little bit of scaffolding should no one know. This professor did neither of these things. Story 12. Our French teacher held a 5-minute detention for the entire class because we waited outside the classroom for her to let us in. You know, like polite kids do. She claimed we were wasting her time and sent a detention note home to all parents. Better still, on results day, she said, "Wow, I didn't expect you to get an A." Story 13. We were about 10 to 11 years old. It was the last period of the day and the music teacher was subbing our science class. He was sitting on the computer and we were all getting on with work. Towards the end of the period, our homeroom teacher comes into the classroom and exclaims, "It's the end of the day. Why are you all not packed up?" To which the music teacher replied, "I told them and they refused to." Excuse you? He hadn't said a thing to us, so we all protested. Even so, our homeroom teacher told us off for being disobedient as the music teacher slithered out of the room and we had to stay 10 minutes late as punishment. Story 14. The class was doing a project on criminal justice and held a mock trial. My friend got assigned to play a role of an assault victim. In real life, she had been a victim of an assault that was very similar to that of the character. She felt it would be too emotionally draining and tried to get out of the part. The teacher wanted an explanation, but my friend kept saying it was very personal. This went back and forth a few times over the next 2 days, and it was just not clicking in the teacher's head. Finally, he lost his patience and yelled out, "You're holding up this whole project for everyone. Why the hell is it so difficult for you?" With the whole class paying attention, she admitted she had been assaulted the same way this character had and went to cry. They changed the topic of the project after that, but the class never really looked at the teacher the same way again. Story 15. Teachers spend weeks teaching us the Schindler method of learning about natural science instead of teaching from the book. On test day, he gave us the test that came with the teacher's version of the book, so we never even covered the info on the test. We all scored very poorly, but learned to ignore him in class and study the book on our own. Story 16. My German teacher would make you retake spelling tests until you got 100%. Once you did, you could sit and do whatever you like until the whole class got 100%. This caused a lot of pressure on everyone as he used to belittle the students who didn't pass first or the second time. If you were the only one left, he would stand over you and watch you struggle. On test day, I decided to bunk off and I got caught. I burst into tears and explained how horrible this teacher was and that I'm never going back into his class. I was moved into a higher set German class with an amazing teacher and my German improved. Story 17. This was my second year in school. My teacher, unable to manage 20 of these rowdy kids, is pretty enraged by the end of the class. She has a thing about counting every piece of equipment after class, and she begins counting the Newton meters. Now, if you don't know what these are, they are literally a metal spring with plastic around it that measures just how much an item weighs. This teacher counted 19 when they were definitely 20. So she holds us back from lunch. She brings the faculty head in, and we get a bollocking from her. Cannot steal from the school. Unjust, yada yada yada. If we were rowdy before, we're raging now, and she requests the least well-behaved kids open their bags. Of course, these kids are protesting, but the teacher offers detention if they don't comply. So after rummaging through a bunch of prepubescent kids' bags and finding nothing, she finally goes back to her desk to find a Newton meter sitting behind her world's best teacher mug. The look on her face. Priceless. Story 18. This math teacher had a reputation for being a hard case and gave a lot of spontaneous tests. He played up one specific revision test, which was right before midterm or final I think, as being a really big deal where the result would reflect on where you have any potential in the subject, and the usual dramatic spiel. After we did them, he went on holiday and took the test with him to correct. Effer forgot to bring them back and nobody ever got their result. Another bonus, the same teacher had a double period before a double period of gym, and sometimes 10 minutes before the bell goes, he'll just say, "We haven't covered enough, so instead of gym, you'll have another double math now." Story 19. I had one of those teachers that would just put a bunch of activities on the board and browse something on their laptops all lesson. Worst part was, it was a math teacher. The only thing she'd do was maybe tell us to shut up once or twice, apart from one time. Possibly after one of us had a word with someone about how little she did, she suddenly snapped and sent the entire class outside until we were ready to do work. We all just laughed our butts off and browsed our phones. The ones who actually cared about algebra went back in, until the teacher decided to come and check on us. us. She just stood there. We were all completely silent until I decided to break the silence. Nice of you to join us. Oh boy. Basically, after that, we compiled a doc of what she'd been doing so we could have a talk with a dean or something about what had been going on. But not before someone accidentally shared it with the teacher. And so for the last term she was with us, she improved. So yeah, that's my story. Story 20. I was in the school finals of some general knowledge quiz or competition. The question I was asked was, what is the collective noun of a group of whales? I answered confidently, a pod. The illiterate bloody teacher had a school written on her answer card. Refused to listen when I assured her it was indeed a pod. Her ignorance cost me the grand title, and I was practically in tears, in front of the whole school, at the injustice of it. Everyone then labeled me as a bad loser. We'll never forget it. Still seethe on it from time to time. It happened in 1985. Story 21. A girl in 3 of my classes was allowed by the administration to have her cell phone during classes because her father was dying. I was aware of the situation since it was happening for a week, and she often had little breakdowns. One day, in the first period, her phone vibrates while the teacher is talking. He disregards the fact that she'll be allowed to have her phone and demands she hand it over to him. I believe he said something along the lines of, I'll read it, and if it's not your mother, then I'm keeping it, her phone, for the rest of the class because it rang while I was talking. Well, the girl flips out. Starts crying as soon as she sees her phone screen. She said, no, she's leaving. This starts a standoff between the teacher and her. He ends up blocking the doorway while still demanding her phone. His logic was if he didn't know it was her mom texting her, then he can't let her leave. At this point, she's inconsolable, and everyone in the class is screaming at him to let her go. F your complex, dude, let her go. And he's screaming back, I'm in charge here, to the point the class made so much noise that security came in to see what was going on. Security tells the girl to go to the office. Her dad did die that day, and she wasn't in school for a month. The teacher had a leave of absence as well, and we had a sub the rest of the year. From then on, students were not allowed special circumstances for cell phones, and teachers were not allowed to block students from leaving. The real kicker was this was intro to photography, and most students were there because we had to take a mandatory elective. Story 22. The teacher told us we couldn't keep a bottle of water in our lockers because it could be vodka or something. I told her she could smell it and check. That's not my job. And that I could just use the drinking fountain. I asked her if she would use the drinking fountain instead of her mug/the tap in the teacher's lounge. She wouldn't answer. Story 23. I had to pee. Then I asked to go to the restroom. The substitute, full-time teacher for another class, said, you don't have to pee, just sit down. After a bit more pleading and begging, I just peed my pants. I was 8 and totally mortified. What made it worse is that the teacher told my parents that I should have spoken up earlier and accidents happen. I still think I should have peed on her desk. Story 24. My teacher lost my finals, then made me retake them while making passive-aggressive comments about me trying to cheat. 2 weeks later, she found my original final on her desk under a pile of papers. Story 25. In the 2nd grade, our class was walking in a single file line outside for recess. It had rained and was muddy and slick. The class bully, a heavy-set mean girl, was walking ahead of me. She slipped in the mud and fell on her butt. She jumped up and immediately pointed her finger at me. That bee said I pushed her. I got detention for a few days and had to spend that recess with my head down on a desk in the teacher's office. I swore I didn't do it and no one believed me. Wow, that was like 1989 or 1990 and yeah, still pisses me off. Story 26. In my last year of junior school, I arrived to find everyone gossiping about my 2 friends and I being in trouble for some reason. We'd been accused of bullying this kid. We had to apologize to him. We got called to the headmaster who blew his top, and our form teacher told us that she hoped we get bullied when we went to secondary school. Most of which would have been fine. But when we went to apologize, I didn't so much as even recognize him, let alone know him or bully him. He turned out to be a good guy, so at least I made a friend for the final 3 months of school. Even to this day, I can't guess how this story originated. Story 27. We had this multicultural fair in my elementary school, and the faculty wanted a Japanese kid to do origami at the Japanese station. I was the only kid that knew origami. I was, and still am, Filipino. So they had me pretend to be Japanese and do the paper cranes and frogs and stuff. It was just ridiculous. Story 28. Was talking to the guidance counselor about how it was ridiculous to me that a single missed assignment could drop my grade by 20 to 30 points, regardless of its importance. Just because something is wrong doesn't mean you should try to change it. Why the F would a guidance counselor give that type of advice to freshmen in high school? Story 29. A couple of weeks into my freshman year, I transferred into a more advanced science class. On my first day in the new class, there was a quiz. I asked the teacher if I was exempt from the quiz, since it was my first day. She said no. I did well, especially for not having been taught any of the material. Here's what bugged me. The final question on the test was, what country is the ticket from? Of course I got it wrong. The sentence didn't even make sense. She wouldn't give me any clarification during the test, so once it was graded, I asked what in the world she meant. Turns out ticket is her pet bird. Ticket. For one, capitalize the name of your pet. Also, that's not an appropriate test question. I told the teacher I had no idea it was her bird. She said, well, now that you know I'm talking about my bird, I'll give you another chance. What country is my bird from? I was stunned that she thought I was now equipped to answer this question. I wasn't in class to hear her reveal where her bird was from. I guess something like Chile? She says, wrong, it's Africa. Africa? That's not a country. I was so mad. She also arrogantly proclaimed every so often for the first few weeks if anyone spotted her making an error, they got an instant A for the year. I can't count how many times I busted her in class, but she never stuck to her word. Last of all, some random girls I didn't even know told the teacher I taught the bird swear words, and I got in trouble for that. I never said a word, much less swear words, to her bird.